I'm going to continue my commentary on this book right here. And I'm sure you've heard the story of Jesus and the money changers. Jesus and the money changers. And you think you know the whole story. Well, you don't, actually. We need to go back a bit. We need to go back to the first 5 books of the Bible. This would be Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Numbers. Let's talk about Abraham first. Okay, Abraham was the father of the Israelites. Okay, having said all that, here's how this worked. God brought Abraham into a specific land, and he says, Abraham, I want you to look north, south, east, and west. And everything you see is yours. And it's not just yours, it's also your descendants. That meant that it wasn't just Abraham's, it was Isaac's, it was Jacob's, and it was Jacob's 12 sons. Now remember, Jacob had his name switched to Israel. Hence the Israelites. Okay. So now we're starting to add things up. Now, when God brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, he settled them in the land that he had promised Abraham. And God then divided up that land into the 12 tribes. 12 tribes, 12 sons of Israel. Okay. Now God gave each person enough land that they could handle. He didn't give them too much because that would lead to utter chaos. He didn't give them too little because that would starve them to death. And God didn't want anybody to starve. So he gave them just enough land that he knew they could handle. That's how God operates. Let me tell you something. God's not going to give you a car if you can't handle a car. Oh, you can go out and try to buy a car, but then you'll end up probably wrecking the car, and then you won't have the car. That's the way God operates. If God doesn't want you to have $1 million, he's going to find some way to make sure you don't have $1 million. Oh, you can try, but God will continue to frustrate your plans. Because God wants you to have what he thinks you can handle. That's the problem with mankind. Often mankind thinks they can handle more than they really can. And God says, no, I'm not handing you anything more than what I think you can handle. So it's a constant fight between man's ego and God's will. Okay. Now, that led to little problems in the Israelite camp. Because there were some Israelites that thought they could handle more than they could. And since God had divided up everything, the only way that these particular Israelites, these greedy Israelites, the only way that those particular Israelites were going to get anything more was to defraud their friends and neighbors. Can you imagine that? Defrauding your neighbor just to get a little bit richer? Talk about very not nice. But that's what those particular Israelites were trying to do. Now this attitude just kept going on and on and on all throughout all these years, and it got finally into the 1st century Jerusalem. Now remember, not all Israelites were like this, but there were some who were. Okay, so let's talk about the ones who were. Well, some of them were temple priests. Okay. Are you starting to see a slight problem here? You say, well, I don't really see the problem. Okay. We have these temple priests in Jerusalem, some of which are very, very greedy. And they know that all Israelites, in order to get the blessings from God, had to get sin out of their life. Now, the only way you could get sin out of your life at that time was to make animal sacrifices. Very specific animal sacrifices. Now, we have to talk about the peasants from Galilee. The peasants from Galilee had 2 ways to make animal sacrifices. Number 1, they could actually bring their animals from their camp all the way from Galilee to Jerusalem. Here's the little problem with that. When you're talking about 1-year-old male lambs, well, they're only 1 year old for a short period of time. 1 year. Then they're not 1 year old anymore. And when they stop being 1 year old, you can't sacrifice them. God won't accept it. Oops. And a spotless male lamb? How spotless is this thing going to be by the time you get it all the way from Galilee to Jerusalem? Oops. So it was very impractical for these Galileans, these Galilean peasants, to bring their animal sacrifices from Galilee to Jerusalem. Well, that wasn't a problem. The temple priests fixed that. They specifically raised animals in and around Jerusalem for use in animal sacrifices. So the second way that these Galilean peasants could make their sacrifices was to buy them once they went to Jerusalem. When they arrived in Jerusalem, they would buy the animal sacrifices and then they would make them. They say, well, that seems to be a perfectly good solution. Yeah, it had some problems though. So what's the problem? Well, at that time, Jerusalem, Galilee, and that whole Judean area had been occupied by the Roman Empire. And that means that they were based on a Roman money-changing system. You say, well, there's no problem there. Well, yes, there is. Because imprinted on every Roman coin was pictures of Roman pagan gods. Are you starting to see the problem now? You couldn't go up to the temple in Jerusalem and try to buy animal sacrifices with pagan Roman god imprinted money. It didn't work that way. The temple priests do not want those Roman coins in the temple. They wanted nothing to do with them. So what did the temple priests do? They hired people called money changers. So what you do is you bring your Roman coins, and these money changers would take the Roman coins and give you temple-approved coins in their place. And you would use those temple-approved coins to actually buy animal sacrifices to use at the temple. That seems like a pretty good thing to do. Well, under normal circumstances, that would be a very appropriate thing to do. But the thing is, these money changers didn't do this for free. This was an occupation. And since it was the temple priests that hired these money changers to do this, that meant that any profit that was made by the money changers that they were exchanging these coins would be shared with the temple priests. And remember, some of these temple priests were greedy, and they wanted as much as they could get. And so they started defrauding the Galilean peasants, who had basically next to nothing anyway, and they were defrauding them so they could make their animal sacrifices. Jesus knew all of this when he arrived at the Jerusalem temple. And so, Jesus was getting sick of these certain temple priests that were defrauding the Galilean peasants, and so he threw a royal fit. And that's where the story of the money changers comes from. Are you seeing a slightly different picture of the story now? He wasn't mad at the money changers. He felt it was bad enough they had money changers in the first place. He was actually angry at the priests who were making a killing profit off of the changing of the money. And that's why Jesus threw his temper tantrum. Alright, I will tell you more in a future video. Stay tuned.